August 9, 1942. The black, oil-slicked waters of Iron Bottom Sound, Guadalcanal. The air was heavy, humid, and charged with the metallic tang of gunfire. Aboard the Imperial Japanese Navy cruiser Chokai, Vice Admiral Genichi Mikawa stood on the bridge, his silhouette sharp against the ghostly moonrise. Below him, the sea was a churning expanse of black ink, hiding the wreckage of a dozen ships. Mikawa had just executed a masterpiece. The Battle of Savo Island, one of the most crushing defeats inflicted on the Allied navies in the entire Pacific War. The key to his triumph? Night fighting. The Japanese Navy had invested decades in mastering Yazan night battle doctrine. They relied on unparalleled crew training, exceptional speed, and their secret weapon, the Type 93 Long Lance torpedo. These oxygen-fueled behemoths left virtually no wake, traveled at terrifying speeds, and carried a massive warhead, giving the Japanese a decisive advantage in the chaos of a midnight engagement. "The Americans are children in the dark," Mikawa stated calmly to his chief of staff, Captain Shintaro Hashimoto. His voice was steady, betraying no sign of the violence he had just orchestrated. "They rely on their primitive searchlights and clumsy, heavy guns. We rely on the sharpness of the human eye and the silence of the long lance." Captain Hashimoto nodded, clutching the bridge railing. "Their technology, Admiral, is slow and predictable. We saw the reports from our intelligence officers regarding their talk of a new device, radar, they call it, using radio waves to detect targets." He gave a short, dismissive laugh. "A ridiculous contraption. It requires heavy power, bulky equipment, and clutters the bridge with screens and gauges. It slows their ships down. We are warriors of the sea, not technicians of the radio." This was the prevailing sentiment in the Imperial Japanese Navy IJN High Command. Radar was considered a novelty, a cumbersome gimmick that distracted from the core naval philosophy of speed, stealth, and superior optical sighting. They had seen early, primitive Allied radar sets, large spinning cages atop the masts of American ships, and dismissed them as too unreliable, too easily jammed, and too fragile for the rigors of combat. They believed the unique combination of the human eye, binoculars, and the Japanese ability to fight in the pitch black would remain supreme. However, hundreds of miles away, the American effort, born of necessity and driven by technical superiority, was rapidly advancing. Aboard the destroyer USS Fletcher, an American radioman, hunched over the glowing screen of an SG radar set, was watching the blips of Mikawa's retreating ships fade back toward the sanctuary of Rabaul. The SG set, introduced in late 1941, was a revelation. It could detect ships well beyond the range of visibility, even on the darkest night. Lieutenant Commander O'Bannon, the Fletcher's captain, knew that if the SG set had been fully operational and utilized by the Allied command at Savo Island, Mikawa's approach would have been detected hours earlier, and the ambush avoided entirely. The Allies had the technology. The IJN, blinded by its own initial triumphs and deep-seated doctrine, was clinging to a world that was already vanishing. The radio waves that Mikawa mocked were about to become the deadliest threat the IJN had ever faced, turning their celebrated night advantage into a fatal disadvantage. Lieutenant Commander O'Bannon, the Fletcher's captain, knew that if the SG set had been fully operational and utilized by the Allied command at Savo Island, Mikawa's approach would have been detected hours earlier, and the ambush avoided entirely. The Allies had the technology. The IJN, blinded by its own initial triumphs and deep-seated doctrine, was clinging to a world that was already vanishing. The radio waves that Mikawa mocked were about to become the deadliest threat the IJN had ever faced, turning their celebrated night advantage into a fatal disadvantage. The shift from ridicule to reality came swiftly and brutally in the contested waters around the Solomon Islands, particularly in late 1942 and early 1943. The early Allied losses had forced a crucial reevaluation, not of strategy, but of technology implementation. The American SG and later SC radar sets were integrated with fire control systems, allowing ships to aim and fire their heavy guns not just at targets they could see, but at targets detected solely on the radar screen. The true, horrifying potential of this new doctrine was unleashed on the night of November 13, 1942, during the naval battle of Guadalcanal. Japanese Vice Admiral Hiroaki Abe was leading a bombardment force of two battleships, the Hai and the Kirishima, supported by destroyers, intending to shell the crucial American airfield, Henderson Field. As Abe's force crept through the darkness, an unsuspecting American cruiser-destroyer force, far smaller and lighter, was waiting. Aboard the USS San Francisco, Captain Casson Young watched the green sweep of the radar. The Japanese formation was clear, distinct blips approaching in a tight column. The American ships held their fire until the enemy was practically on top of them, then unleashed a sudden, concentrated barrage based on radar-derived firing solutions. Admiral Abe's command was instantly plunged into confusion. They saw nothing in the blackness, yet shells were bursting with unnerving accuracy around their flagship, the Hai. The IJN doctrine dictated that night combat must be visual. They had no means to return accurate fire against an unseen enemy. Their searchlights, when activated, merely served as a bright beacon, pinpointing them for the Americans who were firing from the protective cloak of the night. The battle turned into a chaotic bloodbath for the IJN. The Hai, a battleship, was crippled in the fight, hit repeatedly by American shells that found their mark through the darkness. The destroyers supporting her were mangled. Captain Young's gunnery officer later reported, "We were firing solely by radar control, hitting targets we could not, and should not, have been able to see. It was like shooting fish in a barrel." This new reality, the ability to see without light, completely neutralized the IJN's hard-won night superiority. Admiral Abe was forced to retreat without completing his mission. Later, in reports to the Japanese Naval General Staff, there was still a deep reluctance to admit the true cause of the defeat. Abe's staff suggested the American night fire control was uncannily lucky, or perhaps achieved through superior optical instruments, rather than accepting that the radar gimmick was the ultimate force multiplier. The cultural inertia and dismissal of radar as a primary offensive weapon were so entrenched that they preferred to attribute their losses to fate or incredible American fortune rather than a fundamental technological gap. This refusal to adapt meant more Japanese ships and sailors were doomed to follow the Hai into the waters of the Solomon Islands. The cultural inertia and dismissal of radar as a primary offensive weapon were so entrenched that they preferred to attribute their losses to fate or incredible American fortune rather than a fundamental technological gap. This refusal to adapt meant more Japanese ships and sailors were doomed to follow the Hai into the waters of the Solomon Islands. By 1943, the American and Australian forces had refined the integration of radar, turning the waters around Guadalcanal into the IJN's private graveyard. The Allied ships were now equipped with advanced SK air search radar and SG surface search radar linked to complex Mark 37 gunfire control systems. The battles were no longer about human sight versus human sight. They were about radio waves versus doctrine. The ultimate humiliation came at the Battle of Cape St. George on November 26, 1943. Rear Admiral Arleigh Burke, commanding a task force of American destroyers, encountered a Japanese destroyer group led by Captain Kyoto Kagawa. The Japanese were engaged in the classic Tokyo Express maneuver, a high-speed run to ferry supplies to isolated garrisons. Kagawa relied entirely on his lookouts and speed, believing the cloak of night was his protection. Burke's ships detected Kagawa's formation on their radar screens at a range of 22,000 yards, over 11 nautical miles, far beyond the visual horizon. Burke meticulously maneuvered his destroyers using only the electronic picture provided by the radar, positioning them perfectly to cross the T, the ideal firing position. Kagawa's ships were completely blind to the threat. At 20,000 yards, Burke's ships opened fire, launching a devastating spread of torpedoes followed by a deluge of radar-guided 5-inch shells. The barrage was an absolute surprise. The Japanese destroyers erupted in flames and sank before they could even identify the direction of the attack, let alone counterattack effectively with their vaunted long lances. 3 Japanese destroyers, the Onami, Makinami, and Yujiri, were destroyed with minimal loss to the Americans. The post-action reports sent a chilling message back to Yamamoto's successor, Admiral Mineichi Koga. The Americans were winning battles in the pitch black without ever visually spotting the enemy. The Japanese term for the enemy's night fighting ability shifted from lucky to the more ominous, the devil's own luck. The IJN realized, too late, that their enemy was now armed with the ability to see through the darkness. The Japanese failure to adopt or prioritize radar, a technology available to them through licensing from Germany, which they largely ignored, was now revealed as a fatal strategic oversight. By late 1943, the Imperial Japanese Navy was suffering heavy losses not only at sea but also in the air, as American aircraft and night fighters, equipped with AI airborne interception radar, began to dismantle the Japanese air superiority after sundown. The initial ridicule had been replaced by a crushing regret, confirming that in the war of technological evolution, rigid adherence to traditional doctrine, no matter how perfected, leads only to the bottom of the sea. The Gimmick had crushed the pride of the IJN.